Medical marijuana has overcome a lot of fear. HempFest has overcome a lot of fear. I-502 will overcome a lot of fear. I'm lucky to live in a pretty progressive state. I believe in Washington State that people understand that we will never have this utopian drug-free society. We don't need to win over the people that like the concept of recreational drugs. We need to convince the people that don't like the idea of recreational drugs that your pipe dream of a drug-free society is never, ever going to happen. What we need to do is deal with reality and deal with it smartly, and I'm pretty excited that with the help of so many people, Ethan and DPA and all the inspiration I've had from Keith and Alan and NORML friends, we're going to do it in Washington State.
Well, it's such a pleasure to be here. I'm Vincente. I'm sort of the representative from the Colorado Campaign Amendment 64. I'm also one of the principal authors. And we were calling this the Regulated Marijuana Like Alcohol Act of 2012. That's kind of the framework that we're working under. That's our message that we're trying to convey to people. So in Colorado, you won't really hear us talking about legalization so much as regulation, and the fact that regulation works, getting marijuana off the streets and behind the counters is a better way. So I'm here as the co-director and representative, but I did want to briefly acknowledge some of the other folks working on the campaign, including the key support we've gotten from the Marijuana Policy Project. I'm not sure if Rob Campy is in the room, but he has just been working incredibly hard to bring very significant financial funding to our campaign. I also want to acknowledge Steve Fox from MVP and Mason DeBerg, who was the co-director along with me. Those guys have been working 24/7 for about 2 years to bring this to us, and we're about a month away, so the excitement is really palpable. So, this in Colorado, what we've done over the past 10 or so years is really kind of build the foundation for this initiative through two main avenues, one being medical marijuana. We've really worked quite hard to establish our state as sort of a model for how marijuana can be effectively taxed and regulated. And if it can be taxed and regulated safely for communities and sold to patients, we believe we've sent a message that can be done so for responsible adults 21 and over. And then also through just consistent earned media pushes and ballot initiatives to really introduce the public to the fact that marijuana is not the demon weed that they've heard. In fact, it's safer than alcohol, which has been sort of the theme of our campaign as well. And really just kind of, in this way, make the ground fertile for this vote. And we're getting pretty close. I mean, we're consistently ahead by 5 to 10 points, sometimes as much as 12 in the polls. That has us anywhere as high as 53% support and 56 with some further education. So we think it's going to be a damn close election. The way we came at this, I think, is a little different than perhaps some of the way this is done previously, or the way some people on this table came forward. And that's why I think what happens on November 6th is going to be so interesting, because we have pretty different models in Washington versus Colorado versus Oregon, and we're going to learn a lot, no matter what happens. We consider Colorado a real consensus law. We spent about 6 months drafting this. We brought in every national player we could, the smartest people from DPA, NORML, from the ACLU, national, and then we also reached out to stakeholders within Colorado. And I think that differentiates us from Washington. I'm not here to in any way point the finger. I just think what we did in Colorado is we reached out to medical marijuana stakeholders, people that I've worked closely with over the years, and said, what do you guys want to see in this language? You're the people that put your asses on the line selling marijuana for the last several years. What would you like to see? We don't want to in any way rock the boat for you guys. We'd also like you to benefit from the passage of this. And in doing so, we made this sort of conscious decision to reach out to and embrace the base, right? The base of people that support marijuana reform. And because of doing this, we really haven't had significant defection, maybe as we saw with Prop 19, maybe as at least we're seeing some headlines in Washington of medical marijuana people. Dominic was talking about this, marijuana legalization advocates that are against it. We just haven't seen that in Colorado. Now, whether or not that is going to lead to victory, whether that outreach will actually result in us ultimately being victorious, I'm not really sure. But I can tell you it has been psychologically useful, and we haven't been attacked by our friends for the last several years, and that feels good, And I'll talk about why I believe those folks lined up behind our law. Quickly, what our amendment does is really three things. Again, we're going to regulate marijuana like alcohol act. It's for adults 21 and over. It will allow those individuals to possess up to an ounce privately and also to grow 6 plants. And that's a key difference between our initiative in Washington. And we pulled on this and went back and forth, and you know, it may hurt us a little bit, but at the end of the day, we felt like to be as pure and true to our ideals of what we'd like to see with legalization, this is what we want to push. And I would say I'm happy. It has not been something we've really been attacked by on the campaign trail. The opposition, which is fairly organized in Colorado, has not really been jumping up and down on this point. So we feel okay about it. And again, when this comes up at debates, I'm debating cops and DAs every single week, we say, listen, we're regulating marijuana like alcohol. You know, I can brew beer in Colorado if I want to, but if I start selling it, I have to apply to become coerced, right? Or I can be criminally prosecuted. So we want adults to have the right to do this. And by the way, how many adults do you know that brew beer? Almost none. You know, they go down to the corner store and buy a regulated taxed product. So, you know, that's the way we're kind of messaging that. The second piece of Amendment 624 will allow Colorado to set up a regulatory structure to license retail marijuana stores, cultivation facilities, labs, and infused product manufacturers. Now, the good thing is Colorado already has a wing of our government, Department of Revenue, that licenses all 4 of those entities for medical marijuana. We've been doing it for several years. It's worked rather well. So I think this is crystallized in people's mind as something that can be done. Now, an important piece in that regulatory structure is we allow communities to opt out. Right? They can't opt out of adults possessing marijuana because that'll be the right under our state criminal laws. But they can say we don't want these stores in our community, and that may rub some of you the wrong way. But ultimately, it's like alcohol. Right? You can have dry communities, you can have wet communities, and we believe that community should be able to decide what they want to do on that piece. A key portion of the regulatory structure is tax, right? And what we did was we allocated the first $40 million annually to public school construction every single year. Right? And it's been estimated this will bring in about $60 million or so in new tax revenue. So a very, very significant chunk of that is earmarked for public school construction. And I believe that's going to be one of the key pieces that helps us win. When I'm out there talking to legal women voters and other senior groups and whatnot, there's a lot of heads nodding when we talk about the fact that schools are crumbling and we need to infuse serious money. And that, by the way, that $40 million can be bonded into $250 million. So it's very significant for a relatively small state like ours. The final piece that this amendment will do is it will make Colorado the first state in the country to allow the domestic production of hemp, right, industrial hemp. And this is something that we're very happy about having that piece in there, and it's just interestingly, it never comes up. Our opponents don't even know it's in there, and it's just like fascinating. So we hope to win. We hope to really allow Colorado farmers to grow both marijuana and hemp. Just quickly, kind of where we're headed from here. We are going to be hitting the ground just in about 10 days with some really excellent TV ads. There's about 15% undecided in our state on the issue of marijuana, which always kind of blows my mind. Like, who doesn't know where they're at on this issue? But the point is, I think those people are actually with us. They just need to know that we're here. They need to know what our initiative does, and we believe we can reach them with the significant TV ads that we're going to be running here shortly. We're going to continue on with our earned media, stunts, and rolling out endorsements and so forth, and then also have a field program. And it's interesting. Colorado is such a targeted state. It's safe to say that Obama and Romney are in Colorado like every 3 days. It's totally overwhelming. It's great for our campaign because we get to go to those events and hand out literature. But they know that they need to win Colorado, and a lot of the field work, a lot of the getting people to the polls is going to be done by the Obama campaign and to some extent by the Romney campaign. So a lot of our efforts have not been focused on that field program. We do have a somewhat significant field program, but largely we're just working on speaking and media and paid ads at this point. So I guess just to sort of summarize, I think we have sort of 2 paths, and it is very interesting, as Rick pointed out. What happens in November if Colorado wins and Washington doesn't? Which is the template moving on? If Colorado wins and it's home grow okay in your state, it may appear that way. We also don't touch DUID, right, driving under influence of marijuana. We just explicitly do not address that, and that may hurt us. That may hurt us at the polls. But we did not feel comfortable writing a standard of driving influence of marijuana. Washington did. So we'll see what happens in November. Maybe that's the correct template to pass legalization. You know, that's the sort of exciting things that we're gonna see in November. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Roy Kaufman. I'm the manager and the communications director for the Yes on 80 campaign in Oregon, vote80.org. I'll tell you a little bit about how we are similar and a little different from the other two states. But first, a little bit of historical context. In 1932, Oregon voters passed Measure 7. Measure 7 was the state repeal of liquor prohibition. If you're a history buff, you'll remember that alcohol prohibition wasn't repealed federally until 1933. So when we go out and we talk to communities, especially seniors, but just in general, one of the first things we point out is we've done this before. We have moved before the federal government has moved. We have shown that states can be leaders. In fact, they have to be leaders on issues where the federal government can't or won't go first. When we make that message and then we begin to talk about how alcohol prohibition damaged our country, how it benefited criminals and made everybody else victims, it becomes a very useful segue to a conversation about marijuana prohibition. And then when we continue that segue and continue that conversation, we point to some of the facts on the ground. I don't know if you've spent any time in Oregon. Oregon is known as Beervana. It is one of the microbrew capitals of the world. It is a booming wine country. It's got incredible craft distillers. So there's a wonderful, vibrant liquor industry in Oregon that is state regulated. And that is the exact same industry that in the 1920s was illegal. It was illegal to make beer. It was illegal even to grow hops. We have stories of farmers who had their hops farms ripped out because hops were used to make beer, and that violated the Federal Prohibition Act. And you fast forward to 2010, the beer and wine industries in Oregon were a $5 billion a year industry in total economic impact, 10,000 jobs in Oregon. So what we do is we talk to voters and we let them know that prohibition doesn't work. Because when you prohibit something, you automatically make it very, very sexy. You make it very, very appealing. You know, if the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden weren't forbidden, nobody would have eaten it. So, you know, when we talk about prohibition, we say it doesn't work, and here's how we know it doesn't work. And on marijuana, we know prohibition doesn't work, but regulation does, and regulation can work. A lot of the similar messages that you hear out of the other states talking about youth safety, talking about getting marijuana out of the hands of kids and regulating it responsibly are messages that we know resonate with voters. And all we have to do is we have to point to the fact that liquor use by teens is at a record low. Tobacco use by teens is at a record low. Marijuana use by teens is at a record high. Because we strongly regulate, educate, and enforce on those other industries, and yet we pretend that prohibition will somehow deliver equal results. So, you know, that is the framework. That is how we approach the conversation in Oregon. In terms of Measure 80, it is fair to say that it is probably the most far-reaching of the three measures. It's most similar in design and in nature to Colorado, in that it is a regulate and tax bill. It will set up a new state commission, the Oregon Cannabis Commission, which is modeled on the Oregon Liquor Control Commission, which regulates liquor sales in Oregon. It sets up a state commission. It's 21 and above. It maintains all of the DUI penalties, all of the provision to minor, sale to minor penalties that are currently in place around liquor. It doesn't include a specific DUI testing approach or level, but it does provide for funding for new technologies to be able to test for those things in a realistic and responsible way. And looking at Europe's model of recent use testing as opposed to blood level testing. It is also a bill that strongly pushes the message of industrial hemp. Oregon is an agricultural state, it's a manufacturing state. A lot of the industries that would benefit from agricultural hemp are currently industries that are suffering greatly in this economic situation. Those are textiles, pulp and paper mills, our timber industry. our manufacturing industry, our biofuels industry. There are biofuel refineries that have been closing left and right because they can't afford to buy corn for ethanol, and they are eager to be able to buy hemp to make hemp biofuel. And they'd rather be able to buy that hemp from an Oregon farmer than from someone in China or Mexico or Canada. So the hemp message is a very important one, but there's no doubt that when we're talking to media, they're not really talking about hemp. When people go to vote, they will vote on whether or not they want to end marijuana prohibition. And so where we stand in Oregon, we qualified for the ballot in mid-July, this mid-July. So it's been a mad dash to Election Day. The other initiatives qualify in January, February of this year, and so the undecided margins are smaller and the numbers are stronger, but where we are right now is basically evenly split. Oregonians are about 40-40, with 20% undecided on this issue. And what's interesting about Oregon, in case you're not familiar with Oregon electoral system, why would you be, it's an entirely vote-by-mail state. There are no polling places on Election Day. It is entirely vote-by-mail, which means that ballot go out in the mail October 19th. People can start voting as soon as they get their ballots. They have until November 6th to turn those ballots in. They also get a packet of information, a voter's guide, that has arguments in favor, arguments against, and that's where we feel we have an incredible opportunity to reach the undecided voters who study this issue very closely. Oregon voters are known for deliberating over these decisions very, very closely, very carefully, and we have in our ballot statements some of our strongest endorsers and some of our strongest messages. UFCW, the United Food and Commercial Workers Union, endorsed us very early on. They see this as a jobs opportunity. We're grateful to have organized labor on board. NAACP endorsed it early on. This is a civil rights issue, if nothing else. We have public safety, like LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition. We're very grateful to have their support. And then we've had a number of major Democratic lawmakers and former lawmakers come out and endorse. Our former Secretary of State has endorsed. Yesterday we had a state Senate, Republican state Senate candidate endorsed, and tomorrow I'm actually driving down to Bend, Oregon to present to the Republican State Central Committee meeting on this issue. Oregon, because it's not a battleground state like Colorado, we don't see a lot of spending, we don't see a lot of time from the Democrat or Republican presidential campaigns. What we do see a lot of time is from the Libertarian and Green Party campaigns. And those are both parties that are very, very strong in Oregon, because Oregon has a very strong independent, libertarian, green streak. And on this issue, Gary Johnson has endorsed us, Jill Stein has endorsed us, and they come out to Oregon, they help us get the message out. So we're optimistic that between the independent-minded voters, the Democrats that are already on board, and the conservatives who are looking at this as an issue of fiscal responsibility, an issue of states' rights, an issue of individual liberty, that we can squeak by and make some history in Oregon. So I'm looking forward to telling you more about it.
Thank you, Warren. Ethan, I want to bring you into this, and at least to get the discussion started, I thought of two things that your perspective might be helpful with. You obviously have a great deal of experience with your Washington, D.C. office dealing with Congress and the federal government. It'd be interesting to have your perspective on what you expect. Let's assume all three of these win. How do you expect the federal government will respond? And then the second point might be for a lot of people out there who I'm sure are beginning to think, boy, in 2 years or 4 years, I want to do this in my state. What are the tips for how do you qualify or how do you satisfy funders that it's a professional operation?
Okay, thanks, Keith. And maybe start with the second one and then turn to the first, because it goes to how the feds might respond to all this. And thank you for your kind introduction. I only wish what you said about the donors were as true as you portrayed it. That would be actually wonderful if it were that true.
By the way, may I simply say, it goes all the way back to Prop 215, whereas I think all you people know, Ethan Nadelmann was brought in and bailed out Prop 215 when it would not have qualified for the ballot, so he deserves it.
Let me say, I think that the most important thing for getting support for a ballot initiative in the state, and this is what I told range of activists all around the country, because we typically don't initiate or pick out the state in advance. We did it a little more in the late 90s, but not more recently. It's oftentimes initiated by local activists. It's really that at the get-go, what we want to know is that in the state, there's already a serious majority of people in favor of marijuana legalization at the get-go. One thing we've learned is that to think that you can use a ballot initiative campaign to educate the public or to move the public is mostly not true. By and large, the role of the ballot initiative process, which exists in about half the states, is to transform majoritarian public opinion into state law when the state legislature and or the governor are unable or unwilling to do so. And we know that in the case of marijuana reform, medical marijuana, decrim, legalization, as well as other drug policy reform issues, where typically you see the politicians following the public. This is an opportunity to do right by the ballot initiative process. It's a process which has been used, I think, for great evil many times by very well-funded interests, and in our case, obviously, for great good, because we're really getting behind the interests of people who are oftentimes the least empowered in the political system. Now, the conventional wisdom for a long time has been that you need to go in with something of at least 57, 58% on your side getting going, and not much more than 40% against. And then anything short of that, you're likely to lose. Why? Well, a few reasons. First of all, if you ask people to vote yes and no on a ballot initiative and they know absolutely nothing about it, more people are going to vote no instead of yes. There's just an inclination in the public, no, not yes, on some new law or whatever, right? So you already lose a few points there. Then you have the fact that people get scared of change. We saw in California with Prop 19, even after the election, the exit polls, more people said that they were in favor of marijuana legalization than against. But they got scared in the last minute, they were scared of change, this provision worried them, whatever it might be, right? So you know you're going to drop off. Then, of course, in the last few weeks, typically, our opposition mobilizes. In the issue of marijuana reform, unlike bigger prison reform, where we run into the prison guards and established financial interests who pour millions against us, so far, on the marijuana reform initiatives, we haven't seen major money. But what they do is you get all the cops lining up, the politicians, to try to bring in the feds, the attorney general, the drug czar, to try to speak out against and scare people in the last few weeks. That's why these things are hard to win. It's why, even though we see majorities in favor, at least as far as I've seen in Colorado and Washington, I'm still really nervous. I'm still really nervous. It's why in California, although, as I've said many times, I think Richard Lee, although I tried to dissuade him from doing the initiative initially, because it was not a presidential election year, it's going to be hard to win, I think it was the right move, because it transformed the national dialogue. International dialogue, right? It did not actually advance public support for marijuana legalization in California, but I think it did advance it in other parts of the country, right? Because people saw that this was real and this could almost win. The debate actually helped move things there, right? But there was only ever 1 week in California where I said, God, this could really win, right? And that was actually the end of September, early October, where the numbers were staying high. And then they dropped dramatically like a week later, right? So there was this moment. But I was still able to speak honestly, Kate talked about the donors, to go to the donors and say, look, this thing's an uphill battle. It's got some shot, but it's going to be transformative for the country. And able to at least raise some money in the final stretch. It would have been better if I raised it earlier, but at least in the final stretch to get that there. Now, I think that, with Washington, Colorado, and this, by the way, goes to Keith's issue about the donors as well. With the wealthy donors, look, some of this is just deeply personal. Some of it's idiosyncratic. A lot of it is how well one leverages the money you're able to raise and where the opportunities are to leverage. Sometimes more money goes to one initiative than another because the opportunities for leveraging other donors are greater in that case than in others. It's a complex set of dynamics. These are people, one thing about wealthy donors oftentimes is they like to roll the dice. They like to roll the money, let's see what's going to happen, right? It's sometimes easier to raise non-tax deductible money for an initiative than it is to raise it for a non-profit tax deductible, advocacy organization because they're businessmen. They want to roll, they want to win, they want to lose and all that, right? But it's also, there's this whole set of dynamics that goes into that. When I look at the Washington and Colorado initiatives, DPA, we were deeply involved in the drafting and research on the Colorado initiative. And we have an office in Colorado now. We're invested in Colorado for the long term. Washington State, we advised and consulted. Right now, DPA, and I should say here, it's not Drug Policy Alliance, it's our 501c4, Drug Policy Action, is putting a lot of money into Washington State. Why? In part because of the funder dynamics, in part because of the political dynamics, in part because of people like Rick Steves and others who are stepping up both publicly and with their pocketbooks, in part because what's going on in Washington State now, the dynamic that Rick described of law enforcement, the entire member of the city council, the Seattle mayor, and the sheriffs, and 2 former U.S. attorneys, and the former head of the FBI, and newspapers in all the major cities in Washington State, and the Children's Alliance, and I mean, all of this has created a dynamic where when potential donors see that, they go, this is real, this could really happen. They created a context and atmosphere, whereas Rick and I were having breakfast before, it's almost like not cool to be against this initiative. Right? I mean, even the statewide politicians are like kind of sheepish about being on the other side, or they're trying to stay neutral. Colorado, which has polling that it's just about as good as Washington State, hasn't had that same dynamic, right? So, I mean, and if I look at the 2 initiatives, right? I mean, the truth is, the Colorado initiative, in terms of where I'm coming from as a matter of principle, I like the Colorado initiative better, right? It goes more on core principles, it retains the right of personal cultivation, it doesn't get into some of that DUID thing in a way that I think could be problematic. But I look at the Washington State initiative, which leaned over backwards to reassure the swing voter. Because we know with the swing voter, right, they care about the kids issue, the workplace issue, the roads issue. And Washington State, in taking a more conservative approach and going out of their way to reassure the swing voter, the concerned parent, I think has actually put itself in a potentially better chance to win. Now, I'll tell you this, my biggest guilt right now is that I haven't been able to raise more money from Colorado. And I'm deeply grateful to Rob Campion and NPP for the money they're raising there. I mean, it's pivotal that they're getting the money to put on TV, and I'm committed to trying to do what I can in the last few weeks, even though it's getting late to do that stuff. But it means going forward, right, to Keith's question, it means if you want to do this in the state, I and Drug Policy Alliance, we're going to help any initiative that's credible, right? I mean, you come to us, we're going to help with drafting and research the best we can. The more the public is already there, the more we're going to be able and willing to help. I mean, that's key. To do it in a state where you only got 40% going in, can't prioritize that, and we have limited resources. It's got to be that sort of thing. Now, to Keith's other question, what's Washington going to do? You know, first of all, we have to see whether or not Holder and the drugs are going to show up the next month and try to do what they did in California 2 years ago, or in other states as well. I'm hoping they don't, right? I mean, they can look at the numbers, they see the country's evenly split on this issue, they see that a majority below the age of 50, a majority of Democrats and Independents are in favor of marijuana legalization. They don't want to alienate young voters. But on the other hand, I don't expect Obama to be bold, because by being bold, he'll alienate the whole law enforcement constituency and all the people that he also needs on that side, right? So, but what we want them to do is just stay out. I do worry about 2 significant things after the election, if one of these wins. The first one is what's going on in the courts. Many of you are familiar with the PAC decision, the PAC case in California involving medical marijuana, and fortunately that was rendered moot, and it's not, you know, but there's a serious risk that a case could go up to the Supreme Court, and where the Supreme Court upholds the ability of the federal government to preempt all of this statewide regulation of medical marijuana and a potentially illegal regulatory model. And if that happens, depending on how strong that decision is, we have a major problem. Because part of what, you know, Roy was talking about the state repeals of alcohol prohibition was they didn't set up alcohol regulatory models before '33. They just repealed the state prohibition laws. So we know we can repeal state marijuana prohibition laws, but in terms of setting up a regulatory system, which is what the public's going to need down the road in order to be reassured and not have this thing go, for example, what happened in Montana on medical marijuana, we're going to need that. So there's a real risk on the courts. The second risk, of course, is going to be, what is the White House going to do? What are those U.S. attorneys going to do? You see what they're doing on medical marijuana. What are they going to do in this case? Congress, part of it depends upon whether or not Nancy Pelosi is Speaker of the House again, or whether or not we still have Lamar Smith or some other Republican chairing the House Judiciary Committee. That's going to shape things. So I do worry about what the feds are going to do. I do think it's conceivable that we could win one of these initiatives this year, and I'm doing everything possible, and it could actually make it harder to win another initiative in 2016 because the feds will come back and slam it down so hard that people will get nervous. Notwithstanding that, we have to do everything we can to win this year and then figure out how to manage the process so we can win a bunch more in 2016.
Thank you, Ethan. Because we were starting a little late, I don't want to go too far over our schedule, but I think we might have time for a couple of questions, and there is a microphone back there in the middle of the room, so if a couple of you want to get some questions, and then we'll bring Eric in the next panel up, maybe 10 minutes. Yes. Is it not on?
Do you want to just have him come up and use his
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike, you can do it.
If it's not working, you're welcome to come up and use it.
Yeah. Mike, come on up.
I'm going to yell it out. Okay. What would a Romney presidency look like to our movement?
Everybody heard that? Mike said, what would a Romney presidency look like to the movement? Dale, why don't the other questioners come up here and use this mic?
Yeah. You want to start? Anybody feel strongly about that one? Ethan, I'm sure you have some ideas.
So in answering this question, I am not Ethan Nadelmann, head of Drug Policy Alliance. I am Ethan Nadelmann, head of Drug Policy Action, because I am not legally able to comment on the presidential candidates as head of a 501c3. So as head of Drug Policy Action, as I said this here a couple of days ago, our choice is between a disappointment and a disaster. Obama, in his first 18 months was relatively good, right? With the optimum and all that. And his language, his body language, and he's not been relatively good in the last couple of years. Certainly not. But Romney, if you look at his language, his body language, his comments, I think he would be the worst president we've seen on the drug war since the first George Bush during the height of the drug war. He has not even had the decency to be open on the medical marijuana stuff. And in the year 2012, when you can't even acknowledge the legitimacy of medical marijuana, then you are off the deep end.
Anybody
Let me just say briefly from a sort of local perspective, as I mentioned, Colorado is sort of a pivotal swing state, and I just have a hard time, if Romney wins, and I think that's a big if, I have a hard time imagining him saying, well, Colorado, you were right about electing me, but you were wrong about Amendment 64, so I'm going to overturn the will of voters and come in here immediately and use my scarce resources to buck this vote. So I don't think it's at least on a local level, we're not super concerned.
All right, Dale?
Yeah, Brian, you mentioned you hadn't seen any criticism of the cultivation provision, which we didn't either in Prop 215, by the way, which is one reason we didn't have any qualms about it. But I'm curious, what have you seen from what are the concerns of the No campaign? Has the driving issue come up at all? What is it?
Kids. That's all we're dealing with is reefer madness about kids. And I was talking with Roy about this last night. I'm doing a lot of debates around the state, and all the other side wants to talk about is kids. And I feel very passionately that taking marijuana off the street corners and moving it behind the counter where people are asking for ID is better for the kids. But the problem is, and I always bring that up, the problem is I feel so passionately about this that we end up spending half the debate talking about what's best for the kids instead of talking about new tax revenue, better use of law enforcement resources, and getting profits away from cartels. And those are the things that actually will help us win. If I'm out there every day and our message is all about the kids, it just doesn't pull that well. People get scared on that issue. If instead the discussion is about new tax revenue, law enforcement resources, getting marijuana away from cartels, or actually getting profits away from cartels, bringing in the system, that's the message we need to have.
Roy wants to respond, I think, as well.
Yeah, just to give you a perspective of the Oregon situation in terms of the opposition. The kids' message is pretty critical. I think one of the pieces that makes Measure 80 such a grassroots sort of core to the principal measure, but also more of a challenge with undecideds and potentially soft opposition is, we allow personal cultivation. The measure itself does not establish a limit. It allows the Oregon Cannabis Commission to establish limits. It gives clear direction to the legislature to take up that question, but there are no set limits in the measure for personal cultivation. And one of the things we have to do when we go and talk in the community, we have to have people understand, first of all, while the measure doesn't set a limit for personal cultivation, it makes it very clear that if you are found to be cultivating personally but selling commercially, you're breaking the law and you're going to face the consequences. It really is more of a homebrew kind of example. We have a very large homebrewing community in Oregon, so that's a useful analogy. But one of the other things that we have to point out is, look, the only reason that we're so concerned about these home grows and this personal cultivation issue is because of prohibition, because of the artificial prices that have been set by a black market. You know, if that black market is eradicated or is significantly diminished, and people have the opportunity to go to a corner cannabis shop and get whatever they want to get and go home just like they would with a 6-pack of beer or a good bottle of wine, you know, there is no incentive to grow at home except for your own personal use. And it takes away some of the fear. And we also have to talk about it in language and stop talking about some of the language we have from the medical marijuana movement, like the grower term, and really call it what it is, which is gardening. It's gardening. It's farming at an industrial level. It's gardening at a personal level. And we can't have the opposition fearmonger around these home grows, because the reality is once it's legal, there will be no financial incentive to grow except for your own personal adult use.
Larry, I think you were about to ask a question, and the microphone wasn't working. It is working now if you want to. And I think after this, folks, we have to move on. I'm sorry, it's a terrific panel. I wish we had all day. Larry?
Yeah, I have both a comment and a question, and I'll direct them to Ethan. You mentioned that Prop 19 didn't change people's mind in California, but it had an impact elsewhere. Frankly, Proposition 19 was critical for the California Medical Association to endorse legalization. So I'd like to thank Richard, because that was a definite positive impact for Prop 19. And the question I'd like to ask...
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I should just correct. I mean, what I say is, what you see is that the polling numbers haven't increased since then. And so I agree with you. It opened up the dialogue in this state and around the rest of the country. And that way it was very good. What it did not do was lift them. You didn't see higher levels of support in public opinion after than before. But you're entirely right about it probably was responsible for Schwarzenegger signing decriminalization. It brought about an opportunity for the Latino and Black Police Officers Union, and NAACP to come out, the California Medical Association. So it changed the political context in a way. So I don't want to be interpreted as saying that.
Right, no, I just want to thank Richard for all of his efforts. But the question I have is, apparently you were able to convince George Soros to back legalization. I guess the question is, how did you achieve that? And is there anything we can learn as a fundraiser?
I will tell you that it's really...
You're going to give us his phone number either?
I don't think so. I would say with George, it was a dialogue of over 15 years. With him going back and forth, and there were moments, there was a key board meeting in Drug Policy Alliance in 2002 that he was at, where I got the entire board to come out formally for legalization of marijuana, and he was there, and he went along. So there were moments where he came along, and then he would, he would get concerned. He would get concerned. He was out for decriminalization of marijuana. I don't know if I'll go away. It would depend. And then what actually happened, it was a number of variables. I think one of it was because he and the foundation are so deeply involved on the issue of racial justice. In his case, it was the realization that decriminalization of marijuana was not sufficient to reduce the mass arrest of young men of color in this country. That decriminalization still afforded police the latitude in order to keep busting them at high levels. And I think that, it's always a set of variables, right? But that was it. And I remember when he finally decided, that's it, I'm clear, and people were all frustrated he didn't come in earlier on the funding for Prop 19, as was I. But when he decided to do it, it went hand in hand with the op-ed piece he wrote in the Wall Street Journal saying, here, I'm coming out on this thing. With each donor, it's different. Each one, you appeal to libertarian principles, you appeal to who else is involved in the funding, you appeal to, the Washington State thing has been, hugely helpful because of the extent to which it's you know, all the political support is going on there. If we were able to make a more persuasive case, then it would bring out, for example, more young Democrats to the polls, right? There's some evidence of that, but not overwhelming. That would be an argument. So it really depends on all of them. I will tell you that for DPA, I've already begun talking to some of you about this over the last 9 months. We're not focused. I think our major focus, at least for now, and barring some major reversals in the courts, is going to be to try to put together, in a broad coalition, the best, most winnable, most effective marijuana legalization initiative for California in 2016. And I'm going to commit myself to trying to get up on and do that. I know there's going to be a lot of fighting over what goes in, and who gets, you know, but I think that this state and this movement needs to pull together on a really, really top-notch, you know, thing. And the issues that are playing out between Colorado and Washington, and the issues playing out in Washington State, we're going to have to deal with those in good faith and do the best and most winnable initiative we can come up with. Okay?
Okay. One really short response by Roy, and then we've got to bring this to. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Oh.
Go ahead.
Well, so I just wanted to thank Keith for having Measure 80 here and had the opportunity to share the panel with the other states and with Ethan. And just to encourage people to check out the Measure 80 website. It's vote80.org. We're really sort of changing the tone, giving a lot more sort of a cheeky, kind of in-your-face, provocative message. Facebook.com/yeson80. It's a grassroots-funded effort. It is $50 and $100 checks coming in from Kentucky and Connecticut, New York, Florida, Texas, and as well as Oregon. And it's really an opportunity between now and November 6th to piece those contributions together, those small checks. Bigger checks are great, but those checks from the grassroots community to be able to say, we have the resources to push out our message. We're doing some really edgy viral videos that will come out in the next week or two. So we ask you for your support. We're grateful for the community getting behind us as they have. And check it out, vote80.org.
Thank you to all of the panelists.